It was Christmas Eve, and the city was buried in snow. Lights were everywhere, music filled the streets, and people rushed home to warmth and family. Just a few blocks away from all of that, a deaf woman in a wheelchair lay on the frozen pavement, her chair broken, her phone gone, unable to call for help. She raised her shaking hands and signed the only words she had left. "Please, help me." No one stopped, no one looked, until a little girl in a red coat did. And when her biker father turned around, what happened next would change all of their lives forever. On Christmas Eve, the city looked bright from a distance and unforgiving up close. Downtown buildings were lined with white and gold lights, trees were wrapped in glowing wires, and store windows were filled with decorations, meant to make people stop and smile. But the cold didn't care about decorations. The wind moved through the streets in sharp bursts, pushing snow sideways and turning sidewalks into thin sheets of ice. Cars passed slowly, tires crunching over slush, and people walked with their heads down, shoulders raised, trying to get where they were going as fast as possible. It was the kind of cold that punished mistakes. If you stopped for too long, your fingers stiffened. If you fell, getting back up was never simple. Nora Hale was already cold when she reached the edge of the quieter streets. She was in her late 20s, small in frame, with dark hair tucked under a worn knit hat. Her face was pale, her lips dry from the wind, and her eyes carried the look of someone who had learned to stay alert at all times. She sat in a used wheelchair that had seen better years. The frame was scratched, the wheels slightly uneven, but it usually held together well enough if she was careful. Tonight, careful wasn't enough. Nora wore a thin jacket that didn't block the wind the way it should have. Her gloves didn't match, and her shoes weren't designed for ice. She looked like someone trying to blend in with the holiday crowd, but small details gave her away. She moved slowly. She checked her surroundings more than necessary. She avoided eye contact unless she needed something. The truth was simple. She had nowhere warm to go, and every minute outside made it harder to keep moving. Nora couldn't hear the city around her. She couldn't hear traffic, music, or voices. The silence was complete. She felt vibrations through the pavement when cars passed and noticed movement through sight alone. Her hearing had been gone for a long time, and she had learned how to live with that loss. Her legs, however, were another matter. Since the incident, they worked inconsistently. Some days she could stand briefly with support. Some days she couldn't feel them at all. Tonight, she relied entirely on her chair and her arms. She was heading toward a community center a few blocks away. Sometimes a volunteer let her sit inside until the worst of the weather passed. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was better than nothing. The route should have been manageable, but roadwork had forced her onto uneven sidewalks, and ice had built up where snowplows hadn't reached. Her chair's front wheels kept catching, slowing her down. Each delay cost her warmth and strength. When the failure happened, it was sudden and final. Nora didn't hear anything break, but she felt the change immediately. The right rear wheel gave way without warning. The chair tilted sharply toward the curb, and she instinctively reached to steady herself. Her hands slipped on cold metal. The chair tipped, and she was thrown forward. Her shoulder hit the ground first, then her hip, then her palms. The impact knocked the air from her chest. Cold rushed through her clothes the moment she touched the pavement. For a second, she stayed there, stunned, breathing hard. Then training took over. Panic would only make things worse. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook and her legs didn't respond. The wheelchair lay on its side beside her. The damaged wheel twisted at an angle that made it useless. The tire wasn't just flat, it was torn open. Nora rolled onto her side and dragged herself closer to the chair. The movement was slow and painful. Her fingers were already stiff, and her shoulders burned with effort. After several attempts, she managed to pull herself upright and sit partially in the seat, though the chair leaned dangerously. It wasn't stable, but it was better than lying on the ground. She looked around for help. A cafe stood across the street, its windows glowing warmly. Inside, people sat close together, drinking hot drinks, laughing, talking. She couldn't hear them, but she recognized the scene. It was familiar in the way something you once belonged to can feel familiar even after it's gone. The cafe was close, but she couldn't reach it in her condition. Her thoughts went immediately to her phone. Then she remembered it was gone. Earlier that evening, near a transit stop, a man had offered to help her with a curb. He had smiled, taken the phone from her lap, and walked away before she realized what was happening. Along with the phone went her wallet and her identification. She had tried to follow him with her eyes, but he disappeared into the crowd. Without her phone, she had no way to call for help. Without her ID, she had no easy way to explain who she was. The cold intensified as snow collected on her sleeves. Her breath fogged the air. Nora raised her hands and turned toward the cafe window. She signed clearly and deliberately, "Help, please, I fell." Her hands moved with practiced precision. She had used sign language for years, not only to communicate, but to assert her presence in a world that often ignored her. She signed again, larger this time, hoping someone would notice. No one inside reacted. The people closest to the window were focused on their food and their conversations. A barista turned away to work the espresso machine. No one looked up. Nora's chest tightened. She signed again, slower, more urgently. "Help, please." Her arms began to tremble, partly from cold, partly from exhaustion. She hated how exposed she felt. She hated needing help and not being able to ask for it in a way people understood. The city moved around her without slowing down. She glanced at her broken wheel again. There was no fixing it here. Staying meant risking hypothermia. She tried to calculate how long she could last. The answer scared her. As she waited, memories surfaced without permission. Not dramatic ones, just ordinary things she had lost. Hearing her own footsteps, locking her apartment door at night, doing work she was proud of. All of it had disappeared after the incident everyone insisted on calling an accident. Equipment failure, they said. Bad luck. But Nora knew better. She had seen the patterns, the timing, the people who benefited when she was silenced. She didn't have proof yet, only certainty and consequences. A movement across the street caught her attention. A young girl had stopped near a small public plaza where a Christmas tree stood covered in lights. The girl wore a bright red coat with white trim and a matching hat. She looked about 8 or 9 years old. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she held a paper cup in both hands as if it were important. Unlike the adults around her, she wasn't rushing. She was watching. At the girl's side stood a large dog wearing a canine harness. The dog was calm but alert, its body positioned protectively near the child. Its eyes were fixed on Nora. It didn't bark or move suddenly. It simply observed. The girl's gaze shifted from Nora's tilted wheelchair to her hands. Confusion crossed her face, followed by concern. She took a step forward, then hesitated. She turned her head as if looking for someone behind her. Nora followed the girl's line of sight and saw a man standing near a motorcycle parked at the curb. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black leather jacket. His arms were exposed enough to show tattoos running down his forearms. He looked to be around 50, with a solid build and a posture that suggested confidence and restraint. He wasn't moving much. He stood with the stillness of someone used to watching rather than reacting. The girl started toward him carefully, the dog moving with her. Nora watched, heart pounding. She didn't know if this would change anything. She didn't know if the man would help or if the girl would be told to move along. But for the first time since she fell, someone had noticed her and understood that she was asking for help. Snow continued to fall, covering the street in a thin white layer. Nora sat in her broken chair, cold and exposed, watching the girl in red approach the man by the motorcycle. She brought her hands together one more time and signed the same word quietly to herself, steadying her breath and her resolve. Help. The man by the motorcycle noticed the girl approaching before she reached him. He had been watching the street without looking like he was watching it, a habit formed over years of paying attention, without drawing attention to himself. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a solid build that suggested strength earned slowly rather than aggressively. His black leather jacket was old and broken in, creased at the elbows and darkened by weather. Tattoos ran down both forearms, faded in places, dense in others, the kind done over time rather than all at once. His hair was gray at the temples, cropped short, and his face carried deep lines around the eyes and mouth, not from smiling often, but from surviving long enough to learn when not to. His name was Jack Mercer. He was 51 years old, a former soldier, a longtime biker, and a man who didn't believe in rushing toward problems, but also didn't believe in walking away from them. He stood beside a large touring motorcycle, its engine still warm, saddlebags strapped tight. The bike looked heavy, dependable, built for long distances and bad conditions. Jack rested one gloved hand on the seat, while the other hung loose at his side. The girl in red stopped in front of him, breath visible in the cold. She looked up, her eyes wide, serious in a way that didn't match her age. She pointed back across the street toward Nora, then made an awkward motion with her hands, mimicking the signs she had just seen. Jack followed her gesture without hesitation. His gaze landed on the woman in the wheelchair almost immediately. He took in the broken wheel, the way the chair leaned, the woman's stiff posture, the way her hands were clenched together as if holding on to control by force alone. Jack didn't sigh or curse or ask why this was happening now, on Christmas Eve, in this weather. He had learned long ago that timing didn't matter to problems. Problems arrived when they arrived. Beside the girl, the canine shifted its weight. The dog was older, its muzzle touched with gray, but its posture was steady and alert. Jack trusted the dog's instincts. The animal wasn't agitated, wasn't growling or pulling. It was focused. That told him enough. "You stay right here," Jack said to the girl, keeping his voice calm and even. He didn't raise it. He didn't soften it artificially. He spoke to her the way he spoke to adults, because children notice that kind of respect. She nodded quickly, clutching her cup tighter. The dog sat beside her without being told. Jack crossed the street carefully, boots finding traction where they could. Snow crunched underfoot. Traffic slowed to let him pass. He stopped a few feet from Nora, close enough to help but far enough not to crowd her. He crouched slightly to bring himself into her line of sight. Nora looked up at him, her expression guarded. She had learned not to assume kindness. Jack saw that immediately. He didn't reach for her or the chair. He raised, his hands slowly, palms visible, a universal signal of intention. Then he signed, simple and deliberate, the way someone does when they know just enough to be understood. "Are you hurt?" Nora blinked. Surprise crossed her face before she could hide it. She nodded once, then signed back. "Wheel broken, cold, can't move." Jack nodded, acknowledging each point. He didn't pretend to understand everything perfectly, but he understood enough. He glanced at the wheel, then at her hands. He noticed the way her fingers were stiff and slightly discolored from cold. "Okay," he said aloud, more for his own grounding than for her. Then he signed again, slower. "I can help. Don't move yet." He shrugged out of his jacket without hesitation and draped it over her shoulders, careful not to startle her. The leather was heavy and warm, still holding his body heat. Nora stiffened for a moment, then relaxed slightly as the warmth settled in. Jack noticed the tension leave her shoulders by degrees, not all at once. He crouched lower to examine the chair. The damage was clear. The wheel was torn badly enough that rolling it even a short distance would be dangerous. Jack straightened and met her eyes again. "This can't roll. I'll move you. Is that okay?" His signing was not perfect, but it was respectful. He waited for her answer. Nora hesitated. Every instinct she had told her to be careful. She didn't know this man. She didn't know his intentions. But she also knew the cold was winning. She nodded and signed. "Yes, thank you." Jack nodded once. No smile, no unnecessary reassurance. Just action. He moved with efficiency, the kind that came from years of lifting people carefully. He positioned himself so he could support her weight without straining her injured side. He spoke as he moved, low and steady, even though he knew she couldn't hear him fully. He did it anyway, because tone mattered, because people deserved narration when their body was being moved. "I've got you," he said, as he slid one arm behind her shoulders and the other under her knees. He lifted smoothly, keeping her close to his chest to block the wind. Nora gasped slightly at the sudden change in position, then steadied herself by gripping the front of his jacket. He was solid, warm, and didn't smell like alcohol or panic. That mattered more than she expected. Jack carried her across the street without rushing. The girl watched from the curb, eyes fixed on them, the canine standing now, body angled protectively toward both of them. Jack set Nora down carefully on the edge of a low concrete bench near the plaza, where lights from the Christmas tree cast a steady glow and blocked some of the wind. He crouched in front of her again and signed. "Better here. Stay warm. I'll get the chair." Nora nodded, her breathing still uneven but steadier now. Jack crossed back to the wheelchair, righted it, and dragged it over with controlled effort. He set it beside her, positioning it so it wouldn't tip again. He then removed a small thermal blanket from one of his saddlebags and wrapped it around her legs, tucking it in carefully. The girl approached now, slowly, as if checking whether it was allowed. Jack looked at her and nodded. She stepped closer, eyes flicking between Nora and Jack. "She okay?" the girl asked softly. Jack glanced at Nora, then back at the girl. "She will be," he said. "You did the right thing." The girl nodded seriously, absorbing that. The dog lay down at Jack's feet, still alert but calm. Jack turned back to Nora and signed again. "Where were you going?" Nora answered honestly. "Community center, a few blocks, warm place." Jack checked his watch, then he signed. "It's far, very cold, we'll find better." Nora looked at him, searching his face. She signed carefully. "I don't have phone or ID." Jack didn't react outwardly. He simply nodded, accepting the information as data, not judgment. He signed back. "That's okay. We'll handle one thing at a time." Snow continued to fall around them, quieter here beneath the tree lights. People passed at a distance, some glancing over, most not. Jack stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Nora without blocking her view, a subtle shield against the street. The girl leaned against the bench beside Nora, offering her cup. "It's hot chocolate," she said. "My dad says it helps." Nora hesitated, then accepted it with a small nod, wrapping her hands around the warmth. Jack watched the scene, then looked back toward his motorcycle and the dark street beyond. He knew this night was no longer simple. He also knew he wasn't going anywhere. Jack didn't ask Nora where she wanted to go. He didn't ask because he already knew the answer would be complicated, and complicated questions didn't belong on a freezing sidewalk in the middle of Christmas Eve. Instead, he focused on what he could control. He wheeled the chair slowly toward his motorcycle, positioning it so it wouldn't slide, then stopped and reconsidered. The bike wasn't the solution. Not in this weather, and not with a broken chair. He looked down the street, then back at Nora, then at the girl and the dog. He made a decision quietly. Jack signed to Nora, slow and clear. "I have a place, warm, safe, just for tonight." Nora watched his hands carefully. Her expression tightened with hesitation. She had learned the cost of trusting the wrong person, but she had also learned what the cold did to people who ran out of options. She nodded once. "Just tonight," she signed back. "Thank you." Jack acknowledged the answer with a simple nod. He helped her transfer carefully into the passenger seat of his truck. An older pickup parked a block away, its paint dulled by years of use. He folded the wheelchair as best he could and loaded it into the truck bed, securing it with straps from his toolbox. The girl climbed into the back seat without being told, the canine jumping in after her and settling on the floor with practiced ease. Jack took the driver's seat, started the engine, and let the heater run for a moment before pulling out. The drive was quiet. The girl watched the lights outside the window, occasionally glancing at Nora with open curiosity, but not asking questions. The dog rested its head on its paws, eyes half closed, but alert. Nora leaned back against the seat, her hands wrapped around the cup of hot chocolate, feeling warmth spread slowly into her fingers. Her body ached now that the immediate danger had passed. Her shoulder throbbed where she had hit the pavement, but she was inside. That mattered. Jack drove with steady focus, not rushing, not hesitating. He glanced at Nora at stoplights to make sure she was still alert. When they reached a quieter part of a town, he turned onto a side street, lined with small industrial buildings and old garages. He pulled into a fenced lot and parked in front of a single-story structure that had once been a repair shop. Now it looked lived in. Lights glowed behind the windows. A small wreath hung crookedly on the door. Inside, the space was warm and simple. The main room was open, with a couch pushed against one wall, a sturdy table, and a compact kitchen setup along the back. Tools hung neatly on pegboards. A Christmas tree stood in the corner, undecorated except for a string of white lights. It smelled faintly of oil, coffee, and something baking earlier in the day. It felt real, not staged. Jack helped Nora inside, moving slowly to avoid jarring her injured shoulder. He guided her chair into position near the couch, then stepped back to give her space. The girl shrugged off her coat and boots and immediately began adjusting the lights on the tree. The dog circled once and lay down near the door, facing inward. Jack signed again. "You can stay here. Bathroom is there. Heat is on. I'll get blankets." Nora nodded, taking it in. She looked around carefully, noting exits, corners, details. Old habits didn't disappear just because someone was kind. When Jack returned with blankets, she accepted them and wrapped them around her legs and shoulders. The warmth made her eyes sting unexpectedly. Jack handed her a glass of water and then stepped back again, leaning against the counter. He didn't hover. He didn't ask invasive questions. He let the silence exist without trying to fill it. The girl climbed onto the couch and watched Nora openly now. "I'm Ellie," the girl said after a moment. "This is Rex." She nodded toward the dog. Nora smiled slightly and signed her name. Nora. Ellie didn't understand the signs, but she understood the smile. She smiled back, satisfied. Jack signed to Nora. "Food? I can make soup." Nora hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." While the soup warmed, Jack signed a few basic things as he went. "You're safe here. Doors lock. No one comes without me." His movements were not perfect, but they were careful. It was clear he had learned them for a reason, not as a hobby. They ate slowly. Nora's hands shook less as the warmth returned. Ellie talked about school and Christmas cookies and how Rex knew when someone was sad. Jack listened with half an ear, his attention divided between the stove and the woman at his table. When Nora finished, he helped her settle on the couch with more blankets and a pillow under her injured shoulder. Later, when the night had deepened and the wind outside rattled the windows, Jack signed one last thing before heading toward his room. "We'll talk more tomorrow. Rest." Nora nodded. "Good night." Ellie waved from the hallway. Rex stayed near the couch until Nora's breathing slowed, then followed Jack down the hall. Nora lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet she had learned to live with. The pain was still there. The uncertainty was still there. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of falling asleep. Morning arrived quietly. The light came in first, pale and cold, slipping through the narrow windows and settling across the floor. Snow still fell outside, but more gently now, as if the night had taken the worst of it with it. The heater hummed steadily, and the space smelled faintly of coffee. Nora woke slowly, unsure at first where she was. For a few seconds, her body reacted before her mind did. She stayed still, listening out of habit, then remembered she wouldn't hear anything. She opened her eyes and saw the ceiling, unfamiliar but solid. Her shoulder ached, dull and persistent, and her legs felt heavy beneath the blankets. The panic that usually followed waking somewhere new didn't come. Instead, there was a cautious calm. She was inside. She was warm. She was not alone. She shifted carefully, testing what hurt and what didn't. Her chair was positioned beside the couch, close enough to reach without strain. Someone had placed her shoes neatly underneath it. A folded towel sat on the armrest. Small details, but they mattered. Movement caught her attention near the kitchen. Jack stood at the counter, his back to her, pouring coffee into a mug. He wore a plain gray shirt, sleeves pushed up, tattoos visible but unremarkable in the daylight. He moved with the same steady efficiency as the night before. He noticed her watching and turned without surprise. He signed, simple and clear. "Good morning, how do you feel?" Nora took a moment before answering. She signed back honestly. "Sore, but okay." Jack nodded. He handed her a mug of coffee, setting it within reach, then signed again. "Food soon, no rush." Ellie appeared from the hallway a moment later, still in pajamas, her hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She froze when she saw Nora awake, then smiled widely. "You're still here," she said, relieved. Nora smiled back and nodded. Ellie climbed onto a chair at the table and watched as Jack cracked eggs into a pan. Rex lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, eyes following everyone calmly. They ate breakfast slowly. Jack didn't speak much, and Ellie filled the space with small observations about the snow and the way Christmas lights looked different in the morning. Nora followed along through expressions and gestures. She didn't feel pressured to contribute. That, too, mattered. After breakfast, Jack signed again. "I should ask, do you need a doctor?" Nora shook her head. "Not today. Maybe later." Jack accepted that without argument. He signed. "Okay, then we talk. Only if you want." Nora looked down at her hands for a moment. She hadn't planned to explain anything. She had learned to keep her story close, because people either didn't believe it or wanted to simplify it into something easier to digest. But something about the quiet of the morning, the way no one rushed her, made the words feel less dangerous. She signed slowly. "I wasn't always like this." Jack watched her hands carefully, giving her his full attention. "I used to work in events, stage production, sound, lighting, big shows." She paused, then continued. "I was good at it." Ellie stopped fidgeting and listened, even if she didn't understand the signs. She could tell something important was being said. "There was an accident," Nora signed. "At least that's what they called it. A rig failed. Equipment fell. I was too close." Jack's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I lost my hearing first. Then my legs didn't work right. Hospital, surgery, months." She paused, flexing her fingers as if grounding herself. Then the stories started. They said I was careless, unstable, that I caused it. Jack's eyes stayed on her hands. Someone else benefited, someone I worked with, someone who wanted my job. She stopped again. I knew that, but I couldn't prove it. Ellie frowned. "That's not fair," she said quietly. Nora smiled faintly at her, then continued signing. "When I spoke up, they stopped calling me back. Contracts ended. Friends disappeared. My name was damaged." She lowered her hands. Shelters came later. Jack leaned back against the counter. He signed carefully. "You tried." Nora nodded. "I tried every day." There was a pause. Not an awkward one, just space. Jack signed again. "You don't have to fix anything today." Nora looked at him, studying his face. He wasn't offering solutions. He wasn't asking for details he didn't need. He was simply acknowledging that what had happened mattered. Ellie slid off her chair and came closer. Holding a folded piece of paper, she set it on Nora's lap. "I drew Rex," she said. The drawing was simple: a large dog, a girl in red, and a woman in a chair, all standing under a tree with lights. Nora swallowed and nodded, touched. Jack checked the time, then signed. "Stay here today. Snow's bad. We'll see what tomorrow needs." Nora hesitated, then signed. "Okay, just today." Jack nodded. That was enough. Outside, the city moved more slowly under fresh snow. Inside, the morning passed without urgency. Nora sat on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching Ellie build something on the floor while Rex supervised. Her past hadn't disappeared. Her problems hadn't been solved, but they had been spoken aloud, and for now, that was enough. The snow didn't stop that day, but it softened. It fell steadily, covering over footprints almost as soon as they appeared. The city moved at half speed, cars leaving wider gaps between each other, people choosing to stay inside if they could. Jack liked days like this. They forced stillness. They gave you time to notice things you usually ignored. Nora spent most of the morning on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching Ellie work on a puzzle spread across the floor. Rex lay nearby, occasionally lifting his head when someone moved, then settling again. The television was on with captions enabled, playing a local news channel. Nora didn't watch it closely. She watched hands, faces, body language, old habits from a life that required attention to details most people missed. Jack moved in and out of the room, doing small tasks. He fixed a loose cabinet hinge, wiped down the counter, checked the weather again even though it hadn't changed. He wasn't hovering, but he wasn't distant either. He kept himself available without making it obvious. At one point, Nora adjusted her position and winced. Jack noticed immediately. He signed. "Shoulder?" Nora nodded slightly. "Sore. Not worse." Jack nodded back. He signed. "If it gets worse, we stop." That was how he approached most things. No promises he couldn't keep. No pressure to push through pain. Later, while Ellie was distracted by the puzzle and Rex slept, Jack pulled a chair closer to Nora's couch. He didn't sit until she looked up and acknowledged him. He signed. "Can I ask something? You can say no." Nora studied his face. Then she nodded. "Okay." Jack chose his words carefully. "When it happened, the accident, were there reports, police, insurance?" Nora took a breath. "Yes. OSHA, company investigation, everything on paper." Jack signed. "Do you have copies?" Nora shook her head. "They took my laptop, phone, later, Shelter lost my files." Jack didn't react outwardly, but the information settled heavily. Things didn't disappear accidentally that often. He signed again. "But you remember details." Nora hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, too many." She signed slowly, focusing on accuracy rather than emotion. The rig wasn't scheduled for that load. It was adjusted last minute. Someone signed off. Jack's eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone you knew?" he signed. Nora paused. "Yes, not a stranger." She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. Jack understood the weight of withholding it. Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. He signed. "Did anyone else question it?" Nora nodded. "One tech, but he was moved to another city. Next week." Jack exhaled through his nose. Not anger, recognition. Jack signed again. "After, when they blamed you." Nora's hands moved more stiffly now. "They said I missed checks, that I was tired, emotional, unstable." Ellie looked up from the puzzle. "That's not true," she said firmly, without hesitation. Nora smiled faintly. Jack glanced at Ellie, then back to Nora. Jack signed. "Anything. In writing." Nora nodded. Emails, performance reviews, before, all good. Jack sat quietly for a moment. He wasn't building a case, not yet. He was listening for patterns. He signed again. Who benefited? Nora answered without hesitation. She did. Promoted. My projects. Jack didn't ask for the name. He didn't need it yet. Names came later, after foundations were solid. Jack stood and went to a cabinet. He returned with a legal pad and a pen and set them on the table, not pushing them toward Nora, just placing them there. He signed. Not today, but when you're ready. Write what you remember. Dates, places, people. Nora looked at the pad. No one had offered her something that simple in a long time. Not advice, not sympathy, a tool. She nodded. Thank you. Jack signed. One thread is enough to start. The rest of the day passed quietly. Jack made soup again. Ellie insisted on helping and spilled some on the counter. Rex followed Jack into the garage and back, as if checking that everything was where it should be. Nora wrote a few words on the pad, then stopped, overwhelmed, and rested. No one pushed her to continue. That evening, Jack stepped outside to take a call. Nora watched him through the window. He stood with his back to the wind, phone pressed to his ear, shoulders squared. When he came back in, he didn't say anything immediately. He removed his boots, hung up his jacket, then looked at Nora. He signed. I called an old friend, retired, safety inspector. I didn't give names. Nora's heart picked up, slow but noticeable. Jack continued. He said rigging files are kept longer than people think, even when cases close. Nora stared at him. Jack signed carefully. That doesn't mean anything yet. Nora nodded. She understood that better than anyone. But something had shifted. Not hope, not relief. Something smaller, possibility. That night, as Nora prepared to sleep, Jack signed one last thing. We go slow, we don't rush, we don't break you. Nora met his eyes and signed back. Okay. The city outside was still cold and indifferent. Inside, one small thread had been found. It wasn't enough to pull anything loose yet, but it was real. And for the first time since the accident, Nora didn't feel like the truth had vanished completely. The next morning didn't feel like a turning point. It felt ordinary, which was something Nora had learned not to take for granted. Snow still covered the ground, but the plows had passed through during the night, leaving narrow paths of wet asphalt along the streets. The sky was overcast, dull and heavy, but the wind had eased. It was the kind of morning where nothing dramatic happened, unless you forced it. Nora sat at the table with the legal pad in front of her. She hadn't written much yet. A few dates, a few names without last names, short phrases that made sense only to her. She stared at the page longer than she wrote. Jack didn't comment on that. He poured coffee, checked the weather again, and left her alone with her thoughts. Ellie was at school that morning. Jack had dropped her off early, Rex riding in the back seat as usual. The space felt quieter without her, more deliberate. Nora noticed how Jack moved differently when it was just the two of them. Still steady, still calm, but more focused, less careful about filling silence. After a while, Jack sat across from Nora and signed. My friend called back. Nora looked up immediately. Jack continued, slow and precise. He checked the database. Not full records, just logs. Nora felt her chest tighten slightly. She forced herself to stay still. Jack signed. Your incident. File closed fast. Too fast for that type. Nora nodded. She had known that. Hearing it confirmed was different. Jack went on. There was a change order. Day of event. Signed digitally. Nora's fingers curled against the edge of the table. Jack signed. Name matches what you said. First name only. Last name redacted. Nora closed her eyes briefly. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't been rewriting history to survive. Someone had made a choice, and that choice was recorded somewhere. Jack raised one hand slightly, a signal to slow down. This doesn't mean we move now. Nora opened her eyes and nodded. She was shaking, just a little. Jack signed. It means we confirm, step by step. He stood and retrieved a small folder from a drawer. Inside were blank forms, envelopes, and a printed list of local legal aid offices. He placed the folder on the table but didn't push it toward her. Jack signed. Not today, but soon, when you're ready. Nora swallowed. Ready for what? Jack's expression didn't change. Talking to people, on record, with support. Nora looked down at her hands. The idea of formal rooms, questions, judgment, made her stomach tighten. She signed. "They didn't believe me before." Jack answered without hesitation. "That doesn't mean they won't now." Nora studied his face, searching for false confidence. She didn't find it. He wasn't promising success. He was promising process. Later that afternoon, Jack helped Nora into the truck again. He said they were just going for a short drive. He didn't explain more than that. They drove slowly through the city, past areas Nora hadn't seen in a long time. She watched familiar buildings pass by, some unchanged, some repurposed, some gone entirely. Memory came in pieces, not all of it welcome. Jack parked near a low office building, with a faded sign that read, "Public Records." He didn't turn the engine off right away. He signed. "We don't go in. Not today." Nora looked at him, confused. Jack signed. "I want you to see it. That it exists. That it's real." Nora nodded slowly. Just knowing the building was there, that something physical held part of her story, made the past feel less like a hallucination and more like a fact. They drove back in silence. That evening, Nora added one more line to the legal pad. A name, just a first name, written carefully, as if it might break if she rushed. Jack noticed and said nothing. Before bed, Jack signed one last thing. "You're doing this right." Nora looked up. "Right doesn't feel strong." Jack signed back. "Strong isn't the goal, still standing is." Nora nodded. She understood that. That night, sleep came slowly, but when it did, it stayed. Not because the danger was gone, but because the truth had taken its first step out of hiding, and it hadn't collapsed under the light. The building looked smaller up close than Nora remembered. Concrete walls, narrow windows, a metal sign bolted above the entrance that listed departments in plain black letters. Nothing about it suggested justice or resolution. It was a place designed for paperwork, not people. Snow had been cleared from the steps, but the air still bit at exposed skin. Jack parked the truck and turned off the engine. He didn't move right away. He looked at Nora and signed, slow and deliberate. "We go in. We ask questions. We don't argue. We don't promise anything." Nora nodded. Her hands were steady, but her stomach wasn't. She had been in buildings like this before. They always smelled the same, cleaning solution and old paper, and they always made her feel like she was already on trial. Jack unloaded the wheelchair and checked the straps twice. He moved carefully, not because he doubted her, but because he respected the moment. When they reached the door, he held it open and waited for her to go first. Inside, the lobby was quiet. A few chairs lined one wall. A security desk sat near the entrance, staffed by a man in a uniform who looked bored but alert. He glanced at Nora's chair, then at Jack, then back at Nora. His eyes lingered a second longer than necessary. "Can I help you?" the guard asked. Jack answered evenly, "Public Records." The guard nodded and gestured down the hall. "Second door on the right. Take a number." They took a number, 42. The screen above the counter read 36. Nora waited, hands folded in her lap. She watched people come and go. Some left irritated, some relieved. Most looked tired. When their number was finally called, Jack pushed the chair forward and stopped at the counter. The clerk was a woman in her 40s with glasses and a neat bun. She smiled professionally, the kind of smile practiced in front of mirrors. "How can I help you today?" she asked. Jack glanced at Nora, then back to the clerk. "We're requesting access to records related to an incident report. Occupational safety. Event rigging failure. 3 years ago." The clerk's smile tightened slightly. "Case number?" Nora felt the familiar drop in her chest. Jack answered before she could spiral. "We don't have it. We're starting with names and dates." The clerk typed something into her computer. "Without a case number, it can take time." "That's fine," Jack said. "We're not in a hurry." The clerk nodded, then looked directly at Nora. "Are you the individual involved?" Nora met her gaze. She nodded and signed, "Yes." The clerk hesitated, then said, "Do you need an interpreter?" Jack shook his head. "She can read lips. I can help." The clerk's eyes flicked to Jack's tattoos, then back to Nora. She typed again. "Many records are sealed or redacted." Nora signed, slower now. "I'm not asking for sealed, I'm asking for logs, change orders, signatures." The clerk paused. That was new. She looked at the screen longer this time. "Those are not typically requested." Jack kept his voice calm. "But they exist." The clerk didn't answer immediately. She stood, disappeared into a back office, and returned with a man wearing a badge clipped to his belt. He was older, gray-haired, with the posture of someone used to being deferred to. "I'm the supervisor," he said. "What seems to be the issue?" Jack repeated the request without embellishment. The supervisor listened, his expression neutral. When Jack finished, the man looked at Nora. "Ms. Hale," he said, reading from the screen. "Your case was closed." Nora signed back, her movements precise. "Closed doesn't mean accurate." The supervisor studied her for a moment. Then he said, "Records retention policies apply. However," he paused, "change order logs are administrative, not evidentiary." Jack nodded. "That's what we're asking for." Another pause. The supervisor exhaled quietly. "There will be a formal request process." Jack nodded again. "We'll file it." The supervisor handed them a form. "Processing can take weeks." "That's fine," Jack said. Nora took the pen Jack offered and signed the form carefully, her name steady despite the tremor in her hands. When she finished, the supervisor took the paper and nodded once. "We'll be in touch," he said, not unkindly. They left without celebration. Outside, the cold hit again, sharp and immediate. Jack loaded the chair into the truck and climbed into the driver's seat. Nora sat silently for a moment, then signed. They didn't say no. Jack met her eyes. "No," he said. They didn't. As they drove away, Nora felt the tension drain just enough to make room for exhaustion. The system hadn't welcomed her back. It hadn't apologized, but it hadn't shut the door either. For the first time, that felt like progress. The response didn't come immediately. That, in itself, was unsettling. For 3 days after they filed the request, nothing happened. No calls, no emails, no letters. Life inside Jack's place continued in its quiet routine. Ellie went to school. Rex followed his usual patrol of rooms and doorways. Jack worked on small repairs around the garage, leaving for a few hours at a time and coming back without explanation. Nora stayed mostly on the couch, writing when she could, resting when she couldn't. The legal pad filled slowly, line by line, names and dates written with care, as if rushing might erase them. On the fourth morning, Jack's phone rang while he was making coffee. He glanced at the screen, then stepped into the hallway before answering. Nora noticed the change immediately. Jack didn't usually move away to take calls. When he came back, his expression was the same, but something in his posture had shifted. He signed before Nora could ask. They pulled the request for review, Nora's hands stilled in her lap. "How fast?" she signed. Jack answered, "Same day." That was not normal. Systems move slowly by design. Speed meant attention. Jack continued. "Someone flagged it." "Internal," Nora swallowed. "Her?" she signed, not needing to clarify who she meant. Jack didn't answer right away. He signed instead. Could be policy. We don't assume." Nora nodded, but the room felt tighter. Being noticed was not the same as being protected. That afternoon, a letter arrived. Plain envelope, government seal. Jack opened it at the table while Nora watched his face. He read carefully, once, then again. Jack signed. "They want more information. Statement, timeline, under oath." Nora's chest tightened. Under oath meant consequences. It meant risk. It meant being visible in a way she had avoided since everything fell apart. Jack signed again. "This is normal, but it's pressure." Nora looked down at the legal pad. "I can do it," she signed, but her hands shook slightly. Jack nodded. "I know, but we prepare." The pressure didn't stay contained. That evening, Jack received another call. This time, he didn't leave the room to answer it. He put the phone on speaker, volume low. "Mr. Mercer," a woman's voice said, clipped and professional. "This is Denise Walker from Risk Management. We understand you're assisting Ms. Hale." Jack answered evenly. "I am. We'd like to remind you that pursuing closed cases can be stressful, especially for individuals in vulnerable positions." Nora felt heat rise in her face. Jack replied, "She asked for records. That's not a pursuit. That's a request." A pause. "There may be consequences for reopening matters that have already been adjudicated." Jack's voice stayed calm. "There may be consequences for ignoring administrative irregularities." Another pause. Then, "We'll be in touch." The call ended. Ellie, who had been sitting on the floor coloring, looked up. "Was that a bad lady?" she asked. Jack shook his head. "No, just someone doing their job." Nora didn't believe that, but she didn't contradict him. That night, sleep was harder to come by. Nora lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying old meetings, old accusations, the feeling of being watched without being defended. She signed softly in the dark, as if practicing. Truth, facts, timeline. Her hands slowed her breathing. The next day, Jack drove her to a legal aid office. Not inside, just the parking lot. He turned off the engine and signed. "We don't go in today, just know where it is." Nora nodded. She understood the strategy now. Visibility, but controlled. Movement, but measured. When they returned, a man was waiting near Jack's gate, mid-40s, clean coat, no visible insignia. He introduced himself politely as a consultant retained by the event company Nora had once worked for. "I heard you've been asking questions," the man said, eyes flicking briefly to Nora's wheelchair. Jack stepped slightly in front of her. "We filed a records request." The man smiled thinly. "Sometimes reopening old wounds doesn't help anyone." Nora signed, her movements sharp despite the tremor. "It helps me." The man looked at her hands, then back at Jack. "Be careful," he said quietly. "Not everything that comes up stays contained." Jack met his gaze without blinking. "Neither does negligence." The man left without another word. Inside, the air felt heavy. Jack locked the door behind them. He turned to Nora and signed slowly. "This is the part that gets hard." Nora nodded. "I know," Jack signed. "You can stop any time." Nora looked at the legal pad on the table, at the names and dates that no longer felt imaginary. She signed back, steady now, not yet. Outside, the city continued as it always had. Inside, the system had begun to react. Pressure had replaced silence. And while fear was still there, it was no longer alone. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with bright lights or dramatic signs. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of someone who chooses to stop when the rest of the world keeps moving. In this story, the miracle wasn't that pain disappeared overnight or that everything was suddenly fixed. The miracle was that one person saw another human being and refused to walk away. Maybe God didn't appear on that cold Christmas night in an obvious way, but maybe he was there in the compassion of a man who offered help, in the courage of a woman who didn't give up on the truth, and in the small act of kindness that set everything else in motion. Sometimes the greatest miracle God gives us is not changing our situation instantly, but giving us the chance to be an answer to someone else's prayer. In our everyday lives, we may never face a moment as dramatic as this one, but we are all given choices every day. We can look away, or we can pay attention. We can stay silent, or we can show kindness. And sometimes, those small decisions are exactly how hope survives in a broken world. If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it so it can reach someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment if you've ever experienced a moment when someone else became a miracle in your life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that remind us compassion still matters. May God bless everyone watching this video. May He protect those who are tired, comfort those who are hurting, and guide those who are still searching for light. And may you remember that when the time comes, you too might be the miracle someone else has been praying for.